Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's message. I'm Eric, the lead pastor of South Mountain Community Church. Thank you for taking just a bit of your time to be with us today. We exist for one reason, and that's to help as many people as possible take their next step towards becoming fully devoted and fully delighted followers of Jesus Christ. And I know that for so many people, church and even religion can be messy and oh so complicated, but it doesn't have to be that way. Here you can belong before you believe. So our hope is that your first visit with us is enjoyable, meaningful, and unlike the church experiences of your past. We also think that the best way to experience delight is with others in person. So SMCC is about more than just a Sunday sermon. We have 5 locations for you to choose from where you can connect with people in authentic community. We want every message you hear to engage your head, your heart, and your hands for a life of full delight. So with all of that in mind, enjoy today's message.
Good morning. For those of you I haven't met, my name's Trevor. I serve as one of the pastors here at South Mountain, and just want to say, if you're brand new here, kind of first Sunday, checking things out, just want you to know that this is a place where it is okay to not be okay, and if that's where you're at, we're so glad that you're here. And also, if you have been here for a very long time, if you're not new, I want you to know as well that this is still a place where it's okay to not be okay. And if that's where you're at, we're so glad that you are here. Now, on that note, I want to start off with a bit of an observation of something that I think many of us have done. I know I do, and I'm willing to bet that most of us in this room have done and probably do often. We have all said we're doing fine when we weren't really doing fine. My bet is that is true of just about each and every one of us. Right? That we've all said, yeah, things are good. How you doing? Great. Everything is fine. When actually under the surface, behind the scenes, in our own private worlds and lives, things are actually falling apart. They're messy. They're awful. Emotionally, we're a wreck. And yet, when somebody asks, our scripted answer is, I'm fine. And I think there's a lot of different reasons for that, but I think in a lot of ways what we end up doing is we kind of end up going through our lives a lot like this little girl.
And come here, look at me. You have to stop crying, okay? Come here right now. Look at mommy for a minute. You stop crying right now, okay? Are you crying?
No.
Not any.
I'm not.
Okay. You're happy? Oh yeah, you're laughing.
Yeah.
Okay, do you want to watch Sophia?
Yeah.
Okay, no more crying, okay?
I think I'm a little bit tired.
Finley, come here, look at me.
Okay, so on the one hand, I want to be clear that we're not recommending this as a parenting strategy. But then also, that little girl has more self-awareness than I would say I have most days. So that props to her on that. But one thing I do want you to know, kind of wherever you're coming from, is that this is a place where it's okay to be honest about the fact that you're not okay. Because the truth is, so often in life, in every kind of social sphere that we enter into, we think and we feel that we have to kind of button up and stuff the emotions down and put a smile on our face. My guess is that many of us at one time or another, if not even this particular morning, have had the experience of trying to get kind of everyone into the car. If you're in a family situation, you're trying to get the kids in the car and they're just not getting it together, and you end up yelling at them because they're taking too long. You're already running late, and then you're driving fast because you're trying to get here. You're going a little too close to the car in front of you. Your spouse brings that to your attention, and it turns into an unpleasant conversation. And by the time you get to the parking lot, everyone in the family's grumpy. No one is happy. And yet the moment you exit the car and you begin to make your way across the parking lot, the emotions go down. You stuff those away, and the smiles come out. Because so often we think we have to behave in that particular way, that things have to be good, we have to be fine, we have to be okay, even when we're not. And yet one of the things that I think has become clear as we've been working through this book called Habakkuk from the Old Testament, a short little book over the past couple weeks, is that it's okay. In fact, it's even good to be honest about the fact that we are not okay if that is in fact the case, that we can be honest with ourselves, that we can be honest with the people who are around us, and ultimately, we can be honest with God. Because that's the very thing that we've seen from Habakkuk as we've been working through these chapters through this particular book, is that he is anything but okay, and yet he is absolutely honest about the full messiness of his emotions, his thoughts, his anger, and he brings every bit of that to God. And so I think if we could kind of condense where we're going today, I think to give a bit of a precursor, you could put it like this. Even when you wrestle with God, you are still in his hands. That's part of what we've seen throughout Habakkuk, right? He's angry with God. He's upset. He's confused. He's disoriented, but he's bringing it all to God. And as he wrestles with God in the midst of all of it, one of the things we see is we take the book, the narrative in its totality from beginning to end, is that all of this is actually not leading Habakkuk further away from God, but it's drawing him closer to him. That his openness about his frustration and his anger, his fear, his sadness is actually drawing him closer in his relationship with God. And yet one of the things we have the chance to delve into today is where the story actually ends. Because we took 3 short weeks for 3 short chapters. And just by way of recap, in chapter 1, you see Habakkuk being upset and frustrated with God. And at the end of the chapter, he's confused. He's disoriented at what God has said. In chapter 2, God basically reveals to Habakkuk his plans to bring his justice in its full and true measure upon the earth. That one day God will right every wrong and set everything as it should be. And now in the 3rd and final chapter, we get the chance to see where Habakkuk's wrestling and openness and honesty with God ultimately will lead him to, which is helpful to us, because in some ways the book charts a course for you and I as well, so that we too can know where our openness and our honesty and our wrestling with God can lead us to as well. And so with that, what I'd like to do is go ahead and jump into Habakkuk chapter 3 and bring this from the beginning of that chapter all the way to the close as we bring this series and this book to an end. So with that, if you would join me in Habakkuk chapter 3. The verses will be up on the screen. So verses 1 and 2, this is what we see. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet on Shigionoth. Okay, so real quick, one of the things we see, Shigionoth. If you're wondering, yes, I'm guessing at the interpretation. I have no idea how to say that word. But also, what I do know about it is that it's a musical term. And you can see that there is sort of a framing to this final chapter that is setting apart this section, this final portion of the book in a very clear and specific way. And it's doing it for a specific reason. It's telling us that this is actually less of an essay and more of a song. That this final chapter is actually intended to be played to music. And that tells us something, that basically the content that we're about to see within this final chapter is far less of an essay that is presented for intellectual discussion and diagnosis and analysis and dissection, but more than that, it is a song that is intended to grip our emotions and evoke and even shape our imaginations in a particular way. And that is a significant process of the journey of wrestling with God. And so that's what we get from that little word, Shigionoth. But then he goes on to say this prayer. Verse 2, he says, Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, Lord. So Habakkuk, at this point, he's opening up this photo album of God's people, and he's reminding himself of all of the things that God has done in the past. Even at this point in the biblical narrative, he's looking back to the things that God has done in the history of the people of Israel. Even prior to that, in the creation of all things, he's reminding himself of what God has done in the very same way that we open up photo albums and flip back over memories of certain seasons in life and trips that we took. He's reminding himself of the things that God has done. And so he starts there, and then he moves into a second section of the prayer. And this is what he says: repeat them in our day, the things that you have done in the past. We can revisit them, we can remember them, they can encourage us and ground us in the present. And yet his request that he's laying before God is that God would repeat the things that he has done in the past in their very own day and age, so that God would make clear once again through his actions who he is and what he is like. And so repeat them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. Because one of the things that becomes clear, especially in chapters 1 and 2, is that in the present moment, right, God is raising up the Babylonian nation in order to bring judgment on his people for the ways that they've strayed, for the ways that they have dishonored God and the relationship that they have with him. And so Habakkuk is disturbed, he's startled, he's upset about this, but he's saying at this point in the book, in your wrath, remember mercy. Which is a plea that he can lay before God because Habakkuk understands that ultimately, in addition to justice being at the core of who God is, there is also love, which flows out into compassion, which flows out into grace, to a kindness that we have not earned and yet still we are offered. It flows out even into mercy. And so Habakkuk's plea is that even in your wrath, would you remember mercy? And so again, what we see is Habakkuk opening up with this prayer, reminding himself of what God has done and who God is, and pleading for God to show mercy and to reveal himself in this particular day and age. Now at this point, chapter 3 really starts to get underway, right? If it's a roller coaster ride, then essentially up until this point, verses 1 and 2, it's just going up slow, slow, slow. And verse 3 is where it tips over the top, and all of a sudden it starts to move very, very quickly. Because verses 3 to 15, they're one section that are basically one entire section that's intended to be read together. And scholars disagree, actually, about how exactly we're supposed to take it. Because the language, if you read through it, as you'll see in a minute, is actually translates best into sort of a past tense, where it's as if the things that he's describing have already taken place, which would indicate that he's describing things from the past, right? He's recounting what God has done in the past, in the history of the people of Israel. And yet, when you read the actual details themselves, that doesn't seem to fit perfectly, which is an indication that what he might be describing is actually a vision that he is seeing, that he's witnessing, that he's experiencing what the end of the age will look like when God brings justice on the earth to its full and true measure. That Habakkuk is having an experience of this moment, and he's describing it as if it has already occurred because it is that certain that it will come to pass. And to be honest with you, I lean towards the latter, that he is experiencing what is to come, but also, as he describes it, it aligns with so much with what God has done in the past that as he experiences this, he sees what God will do, but he is reminded of what God has already done. And so if that didn't make any sense at all, let's just read it, and hopefully that'll be clear. Okay, so Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 3 to 15. I want to take this all together at once. We'll work our way through it, and then we'll pull some things out of it. So Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 3. We'll work through this together. Okay, God came from Teman, which is referring to kind of southeast of the kingdom of Judah, of the nation of Israel. The Holy One from Mount Paran, which is southwest of the kingdom of Judah, nation of Israel. So it goes on to say, his glory covered the heavens and his praise filled the earth. His splendor was like the sunrise. Rays flashed from his hand where his power was hidden. Plague went before him. Pestilence followed his footsteps. Right there, verse 5 is the first indication we have that this is actually judgment and justice being brought forth and what God is doing here. Pestilence and plague being references to that. Verse 6, he stood and shook the earth, a reference to earthquakes. He looked and made the nations tremble, which is a reference to people. It's saying that God is revealed in such a clear way that all of the world comes to understand who God is, and the nations, the kingdoms, the countries of this world actually tremble at that new understanding that they have gleaned, because with it comes the understanding that they have strayed very far from God and have dishonored him and are perhaps not in the right place that they would wish to be now that they understand who God really and truly is. So he looked and made the nations tremble. The ancient mountains crumbled and the age-old hills collapsed, but he marches on forever. Right? We look at the mountains that we see surrounding the valley that we live in, and they seem permanent, so stable, so solid, as if nothing could ever touch them or move them. And yet this is saying that even the most permanent fixtures on this world, in comparison to God, will seem flimsy and fragile because he is that much greater than them. Verse 7, I saw the tents of Cushan in distress, the dwellings of Midian in anguish. Were you angry with the rivers, Lord? Was your wrath against the streams? Did you rage against the sea when you rode your horses and your chariots to victory? You uncovered your bow. You called for many arrows in reference to lightning and thunder. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed, which is a reference to earthquakes. Torrents of water swept by. The deep roared and lifted its waves on high, sea storms and even flooding. Sun and moon stood still in the heavens at the glint of your flying arrows, the lightning of your flashing spear. In wrath you strode through the earth, and in anger you threshed the nations as a farmer threshes wheat. You came out to deliver your people, to save your anointed one. This is the particular purpose for bringing justice, for bringing goodness upon the earth in such a way that actually saves those, that delivers the people of God. Goes on to say, you crushed the leader of the land of wickedness. You stripped him from head to foot. With his own spear, you pierced his head when his warriors stormed out to scatter us, gloating as though about to devour the wretched who were in hiding. He's saying at the last moment, when all hope seemed lost, when everything was about to come to an end, when things could get no worse, this is the moment at which you came forth and brought deliverance, brought salvation, that you saved your people. Verse 15, you trampled the sea with your horses, churning the great waters. And that is the section. And so if you need to take a deep breath, you're not alone. I think Habakkuk needed to take a deep breath as well after that. But what we see is that in this experience, as he witnesses this, as he sees it in full and living color taking place before him, as basically God is laying out this photo album before him, he is witnessing what God will one day do when he brings justice and goodness to bear on this earth in a full and complete way. But at the same time, it aligns with the things that God has done in the past, and it reminds Habakkuk of what God has done before. And as he sees what God has done, he is reminded of who God is. And I think if we kind of summarize the entirety of it, you could put it like this, that God's work stretches from the stars of creation, through wilderness wanderings, upon the waves of the Red Sea, through the smells of a manger, to the sounds of the cross and the shadows of the empty tomb, to the unity of the local church, and into the beauty of eternity. That the photo album of God's people includes all of this, what God has done, what he is doing, and what he will one day bring to pass. And so Habakkuk experiences this in full and living color, and you can be sure that it has an impact on him. And if I could kind of illustrate that, perhaps in a lesser fashion, I think the world of sports actually provides us with an analogy for this. So one of the interesting things about sports is all the debates about who the GOAT is in this sport or in that sport, and I'm not trying to get into any of that necessarily this morning. But if you look at hockey, which, to be clear, I know almost nothing about hockey, but I think I can explain this piece. I think I understand it. If I'm wrong, just catch up with me and let me know afterwards. But basically, hockey has a statistic that I don't think any other sport has called points, which is the sum total of a player's goals and assists, that they basically are added up together. And so however many goals and however many assists a person has, that is their sum total points. It's a statistic that hockey has. And if you look at the NHL, the all-time leading player for points is Wayne Gretzky. And you could ask, well, okay, he's in first, but he is in first by a little bit. Is he, kind of barely hanging on, or how does he stack up to the other players? Well, one of the things that we can see is when you compare his numbers to everyone else, if you took his goals out of it entirely, he is still the all-time leading points player in NHL history. Just through assists alone, he has more than any other player when you combine their points and their goals and their assists together, which shows just how significant, just how great, just how dominant of a player was. He is nearly 1,000 points ahead of the next place person, which in a sense is just an indication of, man, this person was incredible at this game. That's one example. Another one would come from the world of golf. If you look at Scotty Scheffler, right? He is basically the number one ranked player in the world right now, and he has been for 2 years. For 2 years, he's been the number one ranked player in the world. And you're like, man, he's the best person playing golf right now. He is dominant. He is kind of on top of the world. But how does he stack up to players from the past? Well, if you compare him to Tiger Woods, and you ask, how close is he? Is he better than Tiger? Is he about the same? Has he sort of matched what Tiger has done? What does he have to do to be as good as Tiger was in Tiger's prime? And the truth is, he would have to maintain his number one rank, not for a few months, not for a couple of years, not for even an entire decade, for 11 years. He would have to maintain that same rank in order to just match what Tiger Woods did in his prime when he was the number one ranked golfer for 13 straight years. I think another example would actually be Caitlin Clark in the way that she has surpassed Pete Maravich's record, which is something that stood for decades, and yet finally it has fallen. And in all of these ways, when we compare these records, when you see what certain people have accomplished, in a way, what it brings to light is a sense of reverence, a sense of awe for the greatness, the dominance, the talent and the skill that certain people have had within sports. And that, in a small way, I think demonstrates what Habakkuk has experienced as he has witnessed essentially what it will look like when all things come to an end, as God brings goodness and justice on this earth. That his experience of this has left him with an impression of God's greatness, his goodness, his majesty, his power, and you can see it from exactly what Habakkuk says on the other side of it. This is what we see, verse 16. He says, I heard and my heart pounded. My lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept into my bones and my legs trembled. It's a description of absolute terror. He's saying this is what it felt like to see these things, to experience them. But at the end of it, he says, yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come on the nation invading us. He's saying, I know that judgment will come upon us because God has said that this is what is to pass. Chapters 1 and 2, they get at that. And he's saying, you know, the circumstances haven't changed, and yet on the other side of this wrestling, on the other side of this interaction, I can say, yet I will wait for the day when you right every wrong and you set all things to be as they should be. And then Habakkuk goes on to express a certain sentiment that is one of the most often quoted passages in the entire Old Testament, because it's one of the most beautifully written passages in the entire Old Testament. If there was any portion of the book that you would want to store up within your mind and take with you for a rainy day, it would be these verses. And this is what he writes, verses 17 and 18. He says, though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes in the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. If you see, he opens up with a description of absolute famine, right? That there is no figs, no olives, no grapes, no sheep, no cattle. And the truth is, if you take any one of these in its kind of individual sense, then it would be difficult for society. But when you take all of them together, this is describing an absolute economic and agricultural disaster. This is describing something that would be horrific to live through. It's describing something that we would call famine, where people are suffering, struggling, they're starving, they're actually dying from the lack of provision within the land. And he's saying, even in circumstances as harsh and as difficult as this, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God, my Savior. And I think, there's kind of two different directions to take it from here. One is to ask, well, how on earth is that even possible? How does he get to a place where he can say this and mean it and it actually be true? How do we even grasp that? I think that is perhaps the most significant question to arise out of this statement. But even beyond that, I think there's another direction that's worth taking first, which is to say, obviously what he's describing here is something that I would be willing to bet that most of us have not lived through and probably, hopefully, won't ever experience. But the question is, well, then what can we draw out of this? if he's describing such circumstances that are so horrific, so awful, so difficult, that we're likely to never encounter them ourselves, then is there anything that we can actually pull from this passage to help us? And I think there is. And I want to do this in a way that, genuinely appreciates how awful and how horrible real and actual famine is, but at the same time draws a connection from what Habakkuk is describing to our own circumstances in a first world country, in kind of modern society. And to stick with the language of famine, I think you could put it like this. And I'm not saying that this is the same as a real famine, but I'm saying that these are difficulties that we experience that I think have the tendency to take us off track in the very same way that this took Habakkuk off track. And I think I'd spell it out like this, that these are the famines of affluency, you could call them, right? That there's such a thing as economic famine. Right? I know I've had friends of mine who have basically been doing very well in their careers, where they found themselves succeeding. They found themselves doing well in all the ways that they're intended to. And then all of a sudden, something shifts within the economy, something shifts within the market, something shifts just within the nature of the country. And with that, thank you, appreciate that. And with that, they lost everything. And I think sometimes we find ourselves experiencing loss like that, and that can be a difficult thing. There's also relational famine, which could be, almost like finding ourselves in a season of life where we realize that we don't have a single close friend. Right? That as we go through kind of the highs and lows, as we have joy, as we feel fear, as there is sadness and loss, as we feel anger, we realize that we don't have a single friend that we can actually go to and express these things to. That there's not a single person that we feel comfortable calling up or texting or hitting up on Marco Polo and saying, hey, I need to talk about this. Can you meet with me? We don't have a single person that we can express our needs to in a way where we have confidence and trust in their willingness and ability to meet us where we need them. That is a real relational famine. And I think even beyond that, that's one example. Another example would be the reality that we go through losses in this life, losses of loved ones, right? The death of parents and siblings and at times even children. And when we lose loved ones like that, right, that is an incredibly difficult thing to go through, so much so that it's hard to even put words to it. And I think you can describe that as a relational famine. Beyond that, you've got performance famine. I think many of us live with the soundtrack in the back of our minds every single day that I'm not enough, I'm not good enough, that I can't do this, I need to be better, I need to be more, I am not enough. And that can be a crushing soundtrack to live with. Emotionally, I think sometimes we get ourselves caught up sort of oscillating between being emotional train wrecks and just being absolutely numb because we don't have the energy to delve into what we're really feeling anymore. And that, in a sense, is an emotional famine. And then physically, whether it's an injury, whether it's a sickness, I think sometimes we find ourselves facing, in a way, sudden loss, and that all of a sudden we're not able to do the things we were able to do anymore. I know I've had a friend of mine who describes his father as always being strong, that if there was a defining characteristic that marked who his father was, from the time he was a boy to he was a grown man, it was his strength. And yet in a matter of months, he saw his father be diagnosed with cancer and essentially waste away before him. And the defining trait that had marked him just like that was gone. And things like that occur. And I think those are real and legitimate physical famines. And again, this is not in any way an attempt to minimize real and actual famine. But I think if we're to draw the parallel, it's to look at the circumstances that most often arise within our lives that have a tendency to take our attention away from God and instead to lock it onto our circumstances in a way that causes angst, that causes frustration, that causes fear. And that puts us into a horrible emotional state. And again, I want to be clear that one of the messages of Habakkuk is not that it's wrong to feel those things and that we're invited to bring our full, open, and honest selves to God. And yet, we see that the end result of his wrestling is not to stay there, but it's to bring him to something better. And I think one of the things we see is at the end of the journey, what the wrestling ultimately leads to is a place similar to Habakkuk, where this is true of us. When you unhitch your attitude from your circumstances and hitch it to God's character, you will always be chained to his goodness. That so often we end up reading our lives through the lens of our circumstances, reading God through the lens of our circumstances, which we're so often upset about, that we're not happy with. And yet, what we see Habakkuk doing is opening up the photo album of God's people and reminding himself of what God has done and what he will do in a way that draws his attention to who God is. And that is ultimately what anchors him and what gives him peace and what gives him joy in the present, even though his circumstances have not changed. And I think one of the most significant portions of the photo album for us to turn our attention to is the portion where Jesus gave his life upon the cross for you and for me. And when he rose from the grave in victory over death to invite us into a relationship with him so that one day when he sets all things right, we can enjoy the goodness of the world and of creation remade with him forever. At the very end of the book, we see it ending like this. Habakkuk 3:19, the sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights. Habakkuk is saying that my strength is found, it's anchored, it's grounded in God, not in my circumstances, not in my situation, but ultimately in God. And he closes by saying, for the director of music on my stringed instruments, reminding us once again that this is actually a song. It's not an essay. It's not intended for intellectual dissection and analysis. It's intended to grip our emotions and evoke and shape our imaginations in such a way that grounds our joy in the character of God. And so I think if we take the book in kind of its entirety and ask ourselves, what do we actually draw from this? I think you could put it like this, right? That in some ways Habakkuk is a textbook or a textbook set to music on how to walk with God through suffering, or at the very least through circumstances that have a tendency to make us frustrated. And I think you could put it like this, right? 5 steps that we see Habakkuk taking throughout the book, and in particular in chapter 3. Number 1, recall God's work. Take out the photo album of God's people and remind yourself of what God has done and what he will do in a way that leads you to step number 2, repeating God's truth, remembering who God is, what his nature is, what his character is. And number 3, respond honestly. Right? Throughout the entirety of the book, we see Habakkuk being open and honest about everything that he is feeling. And then number 4, reject the God of circumstance, which goes hand in hand with number 5, to rejoice in God. I'm saying even in circumstances that are not ideal, even in circumstances that are horrific, yet I will rejoice in God, is what Habakkuk says. Because ultimately his joy is not tied to his circumstances being perfect, but in the character and nature of God. And in some ways, I think if we draw sort of a parallel from history, there was a man who lived about 400 years ago by the name of Martin Rinkhart, who was a pastor in Germany in the early 17th century, who lived through the 30 Years' War in Germany, one of the most horrific times to be alive in that particular portion of the earth, because millions of people died over the course of these 30 years. And he was a pastor in a town named Eilenberg, and over the course of it, there were times throughout the war when the death toll was so high, so significant, that he was performing 50 to 60 funerals in a single day. And over the course of the war, it's estimated that he performed over 5,000 funerals in total, including even that of his own wife. For decades, he experienced horrific suffering. And yet in the midst of that time, one of the things he's most well known and remembered for is a song that he wrote, a song that in many ways mirrors exactly what Habakkuk penned in chapter 3 of his book. And this is the psalm. It's called, Now Thank We All Our God. It says, Now thank we all our God with heart and hands and voices, who wondrous things has done, in whom his world rejoices, calling attention to the fact that God rejoices in his world, not just in sunrises and in mountains, but even in you and me, that you are someone that God has made, and he rejoices in his creation. He says, who from our mother's arms has blessed us on our way with countless gifts of love and still is ours today. Oh, may this bounteous God through all our life be near us with ever joyful hearts and blessed peace to cheer us, to keep us in his grace, his kindness that we have not deserved and yet still he has offered, and guide us when perplexed and free us from all ills of this world in the next. I think the same question arises from Martin Rinkart as does from Habakkuk chapter 3. How on earth does someone find themselves in the midst of such circumstances and still be able to rejoice, still be able to have joy? And I think this is really at the heart of it. When God's goodness dictates your response to bad circumstances, rather than bad circumstances dictating your response to God, you too will rejoice, even in suffering, even in circumstances that are less than ideal, even in situations that are awful. There is still joy to be found in God and who he is and what he has done and what he will one day do when he removes all the ills from this world in the next. And so at the end of the book, at the end of 3 weeks and 3 chapters, the bottom line is, even though you wrestle, worship. Because the truth is, one of the most significant ways we can worship God in the most difficult, challenging, disappointing, loss-marked seasons of our lives is by wrestling with him as we bring the full range of our emotions, our thoughts, our questions to him openly and honestly. Because when we do, what we'll find is that the end of the journey, the end of the wrestling ultimately leads us to the very same place that it brought Habakkuk, that it brought Martin Rinkart, and that it will ultimately bring us. That even though our circumstances may remain unchanged, there is joy on the inside. Would you pray with me? Jesus, we thank you for this short book from the Old Testament, written over 2,500 years ago by someone who lived in a different culture, speaking a different language, and yet still someone who wrestled with so many of the very same aspects of the human experience that we wrestle with today. I thank you that we see the difficulty and the ugliness of the emotions on the front end of it, that we see how real and how raw Habakkuk was, and that he feels the same things that we do. And yet we can see that as he embraced you, that as he leaned into the difficulty, that where the journey of wrestling with you ultimately led him to was joy. And so I thank you for that snapshot, that insert into the photo album of God's people. And I thank you for the ways in which our own lives are also producing entries into the very same photo album that others might take courage, might take hope, might take joy from as well one day. In the same way that we can take joy from the ways that you've been at work in the lives of those who've come before. And ultimately, we thank you that one day you will bring goodness and justice to bear on this world, and that we get to be a part of that. We thank you, we praise you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's message and trusting us with your time. If you'd like to connect with one of our pastors or staff, you can easily do that by visiting smccutah.org/connect. When you fill out that quick form, they will get back to you within a few days and be able to connect with you. As well, if you'd like to know more about taking a next step at SMCC, you can easily look at what next steps we have by visiting smccutah.org/next steps. And lastly, if you found today's message both hopeful and helpful, I would encourage you to do maybe one of two things. First, you can share this message with someone that would find it helpful. And you can also choose to partner with us financially so that more people can see messages like this. You can find more information on what that looks like by visiting smccutah.org/give. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I hope to see you at one of our locations soon.